Welcome back with another episode of the Marketing Measurement Podcast. Here today with two heavy hitters in the measurement or gaming measurement and marketing analytics space, Dr. Julian Runge and Bill Gross. So happy to have you on the show. It's amazing that you had the time to come here. Let's start with a maybe quick round of introduction. Bill, do you want to go first? What is Game Data Pros doing, and how did you come into the space of marketing analytics and specifically into the gaming industry?
Hi. First, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. So, very much looking forward to the conversation. So, I got into game analytics in a sort of circuitous route. Starting about 2000, I left academia. I was a researcher in artificial intelligence, and I became the CTO or the chief product officer at a number of companies focused on optimization. How do you route phone calls? How do you make sure that the person finds the thing they're looking for? How do you match people in an online dating environment? And sort of gradually I wound up in payments, figuring out how to optimize payment processing and figuring out the right offer for a particular purchaser. That wound up being a company called Scientific Revenue doing dynamic pricing in gaming. And what wound up happening was I realized that pricing is maybe a third of the revenue problem. How do you get a player into a video game? How do you keep the player in the video game? And then how do you optimize the pricing and the revenue extraction? And so it sort of was a natural segue that all the work I was doing on dynamic pricing and all the work I was doing on revenue optimization eventually became a subset of a larger question, which is how do you, and how do you optimize the marketing as well? How do you know where to place your ads? How do you know that they're working? How do you think about the whole question of user acquisition? And that led to Game Data Pros. We're a small consulting company. We mainly do benchmarking and roadmaps. So we work with customers who have a live product, they have significant data, and they're pretty sure they could do a better job at either user acquisition or e-commerce or bundling or pricing. And with that, we assess what they're doing and we give them help on how to think about like what they should be doing over the next year or two.
Cool.
Nice.
Julian, how did you get into science? So I also forgot to mention that you're the assistant professor of marketing at Northwestern University. I think we met at a data science meetup in Berlin, like must be almost a decade ago or even longer.
Yeah.
And you also know Tim quite well, Tim Wiegels.
Because we also met at a data thing in London, I think, 10 years ago.
Yeah. That was the Game Analytics Business Intelligence Forum.
Yeah.
Oh, you even remember that?
Okay.
Yeah, you were at Good Game Studios back then, right?
Yeah, and you at WUGA.
Yeah, I was at WUGA. Yes, I was at WUGA before my PhD. Then did a PhD in quantitative marketing that took me to Silicon Valley, Stanford University. Then Bill and I worked together at a company called Scientific Revenue. We did pricing experiments together and machine learning for pricing. Then went to Facebook, then a visiting researcher at Duke University, and now I've been faculty first at Northeastern and now at Northwestern University. And why I got into science, that's a bit of a longer answer. Do you want me to dive into that already now?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
That's what we're here for.
Well, so I think there's like a few components. So it's for the rigor, the depth of thinking and commitment to a topic, and also the creativity. So the last bit may be a bit surprising maybe at first when you hear creativity in science. It's not the first thing that comes to mind. But rigor, I think, is pretty straightforward, right? Science is about theorems, proofs, theoretical guarantees, a long and big body of literature that you can draw on, not just letting data tell the story. I think depth of thinking and commitment to a topic is also obvious. When you commit to a PhD, that's a multi-year journey. In social science, usually around 5 to 6 years. And it's tiring, and it's requires a lot of discipline, but it's also beautiful and actually highly useful. The way of thinking, you learn the deep analysis, spending so much time with the topic. I don't think there's many other opportunities to really do that. And yeah, as I said, creativity, not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind when you think of science. But in the end, it's fundamental and vital to good science. For example, something that's used in marketing also and in economics are analytical models, which are pure theory exercises, essentially. And they're often only informed by anecdotal observation, and then it's mostly about mathematical derivation of further insights. And these models can open wholly new perspectives that simply didn't exist before. So there's some work happening, for example, by Chris Ryan, who's a colleague at UBC Sauder, so University of British Columbia, and he applies that to games, for example, and is the first person to apply this kind of marketing and operations research mindset to understanding why games are designed in a certain way. Why do we see that level difficulty is usually structured this way? Why do we have this mini boss, big boss structure? And these are just things that are possible in science that, as I said, can open, at least to me, open wholly new perspectives on how to think about things and also how to do business differently. Yeah, and that's, I think, why I got into science. I could keep going, but I
we had quite a few scientists on here that went back into the industrial.
Yeah, Julia did the other way around, which was always a bit weird to me. But
but was your I don't know, hunger for more rigor and then science also driven by your experience from the marketing day-to-day job and marketing analytics? So wanting to do put a bit more rigor on stuff, because I mean we all know how like data science and marketing can be done,
or cannot be done,
or shouldn't be done.
It's rarely done.
Yeah, even though I think like my interest in science was there before I went in the industry, so I always wanted to do a PhD in a business discipline, but I found it kind of odd, and this goes back to, I guess you could call it my epistemological approach. Like, I like to learn experientially, and I like to also dive into topics experientially. And I found it weird to study business without having experienced how business is actually done. And fair enough, I went into a pretty analytical part of business, into analytics and data science. But I think that's really what was the rigor thing and wanting to go into science was always there. But I wanted to combine it and make sure it has this experiential component as well, that I actually understand what I'm trying to research.
Now coming back to the whole gaming complex. So it's actually something that I've observed quite a bit. So I started my data science career 10 years ago at King. And I think back then we had 2,000 or so employees, out of which maybe 100 or maybe even more people were data scientists, economies, game economy designers. So all these kind of
game balance.
All these kind of analytical people that were doing something not directly on the game, but kind of related to optimizing the economics of the game. And there were actually quite a few hard scientists, so to say, so physicists and so on, that went into gaming after academia. Question to both of you, Bill and Julian, why do you think it is that so many scientists actually choose gaming as their playground when they go into industry?
Who should go first? You want to go first, Bill?
Sure. I mean, the interesting thing about gaming, aside from the fact that we all like to play games, right? So it's always interesting to have your work be something that you care about outside of work, right?
Yeah.
That's why people go into the music industry as well. That's why people go into film. Is that the quality of the data and the possibility of drawing conclusions is so high, right? I mean, a game is a self-contained environment to a large degree. You control the environment. You have the possibility of precise measurement. There's sort of an almost infinite flexibility in it to do things. And there are very few sort of constraints that exist in terms of the delivery of the experience and in terms of how you think about the problem. If you were to say something like, I'm a world-class physicist and I want to go into retail, well, the data's messy, right? The supply chain is there. Things happen that are outside of your control. And gaming at least offers sort of an allure that you can actually solve these problems. I gave a talk at the Wolfram Data Summit, which was a conference Stephen Wolfram ran 2014 to 2017, on the possibility that we could actually now empirically validate all these things that, you know, Adam Smith and David Ricardo, et cetera, had said, right? I mean, there's this entire theory of capitalism that was invented 1600 to 1900 and has never actually been tested, really, never tested. The invisible hand on through, you know, and it all makes sense and it's all impressively logical. But finally, we have a test bed where we can like empirically develop a science of human behavior without having to, you know, go look for natural experiments, without having to, you know, find instrumental variables like the weather, et cetera, et cetera. And so the combination of it being a very, you know, natural thing to play games and a thing that is, you know, a large percentage of people's leisure time, and the ability to actually rigorously do the experimentation and the measurement is compelling.
Mm-hmm.
That makes a lot of sense.
Well,
Right.
I don't know what you.
I mean, to quickly add one thing there, I mean, at least for me personally, the draw to, you know, go into a gaming company and do analytics and data science was also the creativity and creation that was taking place there, right? Like, of course, as an economist, which is my original background, fascinating to manage a virtual economy, to be able to run experiments, play with currencies, introduce new currencies, all this stuff you can do. But you also work with a lot of people who are just great creators, right? Game designers, artists, game balancers, product managers. And that was always really compelling to me. And then analytics is actually kind of this force multiplier on creation and creativity. And there's this interesting tension where creative people sometimes think about analytics, at first at least, as something that they don't love and like taking the specialness out of what they do. It's a bit like an author who writes a book and that gets told what parts people skip over. Yeah, they maybe don't love hearing that, but in the end, it's actually really useful to them to up-level their creative game. And yeah, so I think that's the other thing. So the richness of data, the depth of the experiences, also the heterogeneity of the experiences, right? Like, I don't think there's many digital products that have as diverse customer journeys as games do, right? It's insane what different pathways people embark on. And that makes it so interesting to measurement and science to me.
And this leads us to a very good next question. I mean, at first, I think for us, I went into gaming because I like to work with a lot of young and interesting people. And I think that was also something, right? You have your own digital world, you can build it yourself, and the people are less, well, fixed on their opinions and more straightforward.
People, yeah, in gaming, people also tend to be sometimes a little weird, mostly in a good way.
Very weird, but that was fun.
Yeah.
But I mean, Julian, you already said this. Can you think of any really unique challenges in gaming? I mean, I can probably think of a few, but what would you say when you look at your job? What is special or what is different than, for example, going into retail, which has messy data, but at least you can touch the products?
Yeah, so I would say compared to other industries, analytic sophistication maturity can still be low.
In gaming?
It depends who you talk to. So companies tend to collect a ton of data, right? Because like, let's say you're a small indie publisher with just 2 people and you suddenly have a hit game or a few, and you start instrumenting tracking in all of them. So you get millions, maybe billions of data points, and you're just like, wow, what's going on? But then the understanding of what to do with that data can be a little limited. And there's some sort of a fallacy there a little bit where the idea is sort of like, oh, we now have a lot of data, there must be a lot of value in this data. And that's not necessarily true, because I think the value of insight is not necessarily where you have most data, right? It might actually be the exact inverse, where it's much more about coming up with the best next game idea based on smart analysis of your data, but also qualitative user research and understanding the market and so on. And relatedly, right, like gaming can be pretty hit or miss. I think that's also why historically investors have shied away from it. Then we went through this massive growth phase over the last decade or so, where that became different and it seemed to be more predictable. But I think we're actually going to enter a hit or miss phase again a little bit. And low predictability also just means that analytics can be a little more tricky to use. I think the value is still just as high and it's just as crucial to success. But yeah, I think those are some challenges in gaming I've seen. And like, when it comes to experimentation, something that, I think is a core part of how analytics should be used in companies, not only in product analytics, but also in marketing analytics, which I'm sure we'll talk about more later. But when it comes to that specifically, there's some challenges in gaming that I'd love to briefly, and we already kind of touched on them, but just to summarize them, right? You have these highly engaged communities. So that gives you a lot of data, but you also can irritate them easily. So you need to make sure that your experiments don't alienate players. And that I think is more important than in retail, e-commerce, direct to consumer, you name it. You also have these complex immersive systems involving matchmaking algorithms, which have many interdependent elements and lead to these highly unique customer journeys. So to understand effects in these complex systems, you need some relatively smart modeling, I think, to get that right. I'll maybe stop here, but
I was just going to say, I would love to start talking about experimentation, certainly also in the sort of relation to measurement. But Bill, just your thoughts on the unique challenges in gaming, and particularly, I was pretty surprised to hear Julian just saying that the sophistication level in terms of analytics in gaming is low, because I would have I'm maybe mixing it up with the level of data that you have in gaming compared to a retail store or retail company.
The feeling is probably more there, right? There's a higher likelihood that people know that data is important and that analytics is important. But as Julian said, right, if you're two people, then they might know that feeling, but they can't still use it.
I get it for such an indie publisher, but yeah, just your experience, Bill. Maybe what's?
I think Julian's spot on there. Data is collected. It's often collected at scale, at enormous scale. But there's sort of, the complexity of the systems is one thing. Julian mentioned that as well. These are incredibly complicated environments. And relative to the complexity of the user experience, the data is not overwhelmingly large. In retail, there's a very limited range of user experiences. Even if you're in e-commerce, you go to a website, you see a thing, you buy it or you don't. It's not hours a day exploring a virtual universe. So relative to the complexity of the experience, there isn't that much data. And I would also add in the level of control you have over the environment means it's possible to act too quickly. Changes in games are often done. If you look at a mobile game, for example, there's usually an update every 2 to 3 weeks, something like that, right? Yep. There's a regular update cadence. And that means it's possible to overreact without actually doing the full analysis. And that also contributes to the problem a little bit.
Good point. I just realized as well, because what you just said, like new feature releases and stuff, right? There might be people that track a lot of data, but there's quite often the big disconnect between the product data team and the marketing and whatever else data team in these kind of things. We at Good Games use a lot that we really didn't know. Hey, why is data going down? Why are less people in the game? Yeah, because product did something. And that is really rarely, I think that was one of the big things App Annie did like 10 years ago, that they really tracked this. Oh, you have a new release. You have a new release. And this helped a lot, because as stupid as it sounds, it wasn't there quite often.
So people were hiring an external company to have them tracking their releases?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Game teams work in silos, right? Marketing and user acquisition is in one team. They have a lot of data. They are doing a lot of things. Product is issuing releases of the game, so on and so forth. There's often a third team, a live ops team, doing things like tournaments and special events and sales. And, the coordination is hard. It's not that people don't want to work together. It's, okay, my job is to run the user acquisition campaigns, and that's a full-time job. And I have to work with the creative services team, and I have to measure what's happening on Meta, and I have to understand all of these things. And then product is releasing an update. And
it's normally not product,
we actually
right?
see.
It's normally that's a studio, right? Often game companies are organized in studios, where studios already often a separate company, right?
And it's all very, very fast paced. That's the other problem.
The publisher studio divide is part of it as well. But then you also see things, and this is sort of an added sort of complexity. If it's a console game or a PC game, not a mobile game, the way you run sales is you collaborate with the Xbox group or the PlayStation group or Steam. And, you have an entire sales and marketing apparatus that is dealing with those people. And okay, the Steam Summer Sale is this week, and we put the game on sale for 40% off. That is an incredibly important thing to tell your user acquisition team about. And yet, because you're the group that deals with Steam, and they're the group that's dealing with user acquisition, and you're in different corporate silos, sometimes you don't. And so you're running full steam. You're running a marketing campaign and a user acquisition campaign, and you're running a sale at the same time, and that can throw off your analytics horribly.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, your marketing looks a lot more attractive than it really is. And disentangling that is interesting.
No. Coming a little bit back to the whole topic of marketing analytics, specifically experimentation, which you, Julian, touched on a little bit already. What's your experience with that? I think also you, Bill, you had an article on your blog actually about experimentation. And one thing that we like to talk here about a little bit on this podcast is how do you actually get people to experiment? Because it's always nice and easy to tell people in a podcast, in a blog, or wherever that they should experiment more.
It's really good.
How do you go about fostering this experimentation culture and practice? What are your experiences on those?
Well, I can
go first.
Yeah, you go first. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Fundamentally, it's incredibly hard. And that's just a fact of life, right? In order for a company to be willing to engage in systematic experimentation, because there's a big gulf between we ran an experiment and we do experimentation. You have to take measurement incredibly seriously. You have to have a strong data foundation. And as we talked about, a lot of times game companies don't quite have that. And then you have to be willing to actually say, I don't know. And that's really, really hard. Because what you're doing is you're saying something like there's a statistical apparatus developed over the last 150 years, and whether you go with the frequentist or the Bayesian or whatever, and there's a set of questions that you want to answer. And now we have to say the entire company has bought into this idea that the way we're going to answer these questions is by being disciplined and running experiments. And that's a culture shift that's really interesting, especially, how does somebody become a VP? They become a VP by being smart, by being a domain expert, and by being decisive. And then you say, those things that made you a VP, that made you an effective executive, I need you to put them on the shelf for a moment while we run an A/B test.
Yeah. Because you might be totally wrong.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I mean, because I just want to get like a practical experience. How do you actually get it? I mean, as you said, like, you wrote this awesome, Julian, you wrote this awesome Harvard Business Review article. I also forgot to mention that with Igor Skokan about the gold standard, the measurement that involves experimentation. And you both had a pretty amazing AdExchanger article. We put all of those in the show notes. But like, practically speaking, if you come into an organization and they are VPs and they are responsible for, reaching the goals, and their next promotion or the salary increase or bonuses might depend on reaching those goals. How do you convince them to go into experimentation? Well, not just by saying, put your VP characteristics, attributes on the shelf.
Ego away.
Put your ego away. Yeah, maybe that. But what are like
right?
very practical advice that you could maybe give?
Yeah, well, I think it's actually a little different between marketing and product organizations, right? So a lot of the articles we wrote, they talk more about marketing organizations. Mm-hmm. So in product organizations, I think it's a little more straightforward because you have more control over the experimentation function, right? It's going to be your team that deploys the randomizer. It's going to be you that defines the UX that's associated with each treatment arm, et cetera. And there you mostly need executive endorsement. You need, of course, have the right talent in-house to analyze and set up these experiments. That's a little easier. I think when it comes to marketing experimentation, it's more tricky because you have you have more legacy stuff. That's like people being used to different kinds of measurement models, right? Like they used to MMMs maybe, or multi-type, like attribution models. And not as much to experimentation. That is something that has really grown in significance through digital first business, right? That's what has like created this massive interest in experimentation in my mind. And so I think there's just a little more of like hand holding and stronger executive endorsement, really bringing in new people that can change a mindset, that are also senior enough to influence other people. And then, of course, also some basic things like defining North Star metrics, like is it ROAS, is it something else? And also getting this idea of, I mean, everybody I think is talking about that a little bit these days, the suite of truth across to everyone, that MMMs are great, MTA is great, attribution models are great, but you also need experiments to calibrate those and to integrate these different measurement approaches to arrive at one agreed solution, or at least measurement. It's not a truth, right? But like the most agreed on evidence, so to say.
Your framework.
And you need to, sorry?
Your own framework. I think that's the important thing, right? There's no truth. There just has to be a framework you build and you then follow.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, framework is one thing. And then there's this other thing you also have, and I was at the Meta Measurement Forum in London in October, and whenever I talk to industry people, there's this thing that you have silos, especially when you talk about larger marketing organizations. Yeah. They are both vertical between different functions. They're also horizontal between different hierarchies. The people who buy the media don't talk sufficiently to the executives. They use different decision support models, right? The executives use an MMM. The people in the trenches use attribution. And for getting, these silos broken down a bit, having shared learning agendas that are really targeted out around a specific goal, like let's find our new best channel, or like our new channel that performs best, or, just bring ideas in that way in, and then have people collaborate across hierarchies and silos to really get evidence on that specific thing, I think can be a way to get that started in marketing organizations.
The other thing I would add to that, though, you need universal acknowledgement of a specific problem that's important, right? You need a shared learning agenda. You need a shared problem. You also need a way to approach it. One of the interesting things that happens, especially with MMMs, there's this sort of incrementality filter bubble going on LinkedIn right now, where everybody is cheering for geographic tests. And completely shutting off spend in a significant locale during the holiday season, and that's just not going to happen, right? If I'm an e-commerce retailer, I am not going to say, "Oh yeah, I will shut off all my advertising to the eastern seaboard of the U.S. for 4 months in December." Not going to happen. Period. Right? So you need a way to approach the problem where you can, in a contained way, derive a measurement without significant business risk that actually speaks to the bigger problem. And you need an on-ramp to experimentation. You can't start with like a high-risk experiment that's going to be highly visible at the same time. Nobody's going to buy into that. And so that's really interesting because, for one of our customers, they essentially are US dominant. That's their primary market. And we said, you know what? Let's carve out Canada and just, you can geolocate that someone's in Canada. You can, you can tune your marketing in different geos, etc. And we're going to institute an experimentation regime in Canada. It's a smaller market. It's not that important to you. You can try new things. You can get comfortable with the processes. And, the learnings are probably applicable to the US. And that's a very nice sort of articulation of what you want to do. You don't start with everything. You start with a small thing, and it's a contained thing.
That's great, because we always did Austria. It sounds very mean, but it's very, very similar. US versus Canada, Germany versus Austria.
I heard many times that people loved Canada for that exact reason that you just described.
Or Poland. Poland was also always great for that kind of stuff. Bill, Julian, do you also have any examples of, maybe don't name the company itself, but any companies, any of your clients that really do this experimentation beyond A/B testing? Because I think that's what everyone always thinks about, right? Yeah, GeoLift is the hot shit right now, but otherwise it's always like, hey, we do experimentation, let's do an A/B test, but that's not just it. So do you have any examples what great stuff people are doing?
I think that there's an interesting sort of thing there. The question is, are you trying to learn sort of eternal truths, or are you trying to optimize, right? And if you're going to optimize, you quickly realize that A/B testing is very slow.
Yeah.
And while you're sending traffic to the bad or the losing variant, you're losing money. And so people wind up in reinforcement learning, very quickly. And this happens a lot, especially in pricing, where you say, I'm running a multi-arm bandit and I'm going to run a contextual multi-arm bandit. And that also lets me capture differing consumer opinions and reactions to events. Again, going back to that educational question, people's appetite for educational software is vastly different in September during the US back to school month than it is, in May when students are leaving school for the summer vacation. And so, having a bandit that's able to react is a very good way to sort of, always be optimizing. But it's also explicitly an articulation that, if I ran A/B tests in May, probably the results don't apply in September. So optimize, but not really learning a long-term truth. And in fact, there's actually a Harvard Business Review article that was out this month on your business is A/B testing too much. I forget exactly what the title was, but it's basically saying, a lot of times people have a problem, they have a set of treatments, and they resort to an A/B test because it's the tool they know. But the reality is you really don't want to establish eternal truth. You want to do optimization. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting here, it's one of my favorite papers of all time, is a paper called Test and Roll by Ellie Feit and Ron Berman, where they talked about, like, if you did an A/B test on email and you send half the people to one email and half the people to the other, that's a really bad idea. You should probably do something where you do an initial test and you get some idea of reaction, and then you go all in on the winning variant on the initial test. And the reason you do that is, again, you get one shot at this. And the cost of sending half your population to the wrong email is pretty significant, or is potentially significant.
Yeah.
So I think in email marketing, there's a lot of that, and in pricing, there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
So I have a question on my mind now. How is the practitioner in this round citing an academic paper first? No, but yeah, I think that's a great paper to reference. Well, just to also give my take on the question, what companies are doing this well. I mean, most tech companies from Silicon Valley are doing this extremely well, right? And I think what's also interesting in that space is that, acquisitions that happen. OpenAI bought Statsig, right? That's not happening for no reason. It's because they needed to in-house some product experimentation tech that they didn't feel they had ready. I mean, that's my assumption at least.
So Statsig is in product optimization tool, or like an A/B testing tool?
Yeah, right. It's an experimentation platform, and it has all these things you need, like feature flags, staged rollout, etc. And then Eppo got acquired by Datadog. So, I mean, they're also teaming up to offer this to more people. But yeah, the companies that do really cool experiments. I worked at Facebook before it rebranded to Meta for 2 years as a researcher. And I mean, I saw it there. They were running incredible experiments on the product side. I was actually focused on experiments more on the advertising side, where they also built really cool tech that was absolutely industry leading at that time. So if I were to rank, I'd say Netflix, Meta are really out there. Then Google, Amazon, Apple would be roughly my ranking across them. I think Netflix especially also publishes really interesting papers, not only on experimentation methodology, but also on the value of experimentation programs to the business.
That was also one of the things that I wanted to discuss. We're almost out of time, and we still have so many questions. So we definitely would love to have you on the show again. But just to get back to the measurement topic, maybe also for the people that tuned in, because the podcast is called Marketing Measurement Matters. So what if you run an experiment and you see that the results differ quite a bit from your OCI or from your attribution results? How do you kind of consolidate these different perspectives? And I'm aware that we already at 34 minutes, we only planned 30 minutes for this, but take your time in answering that, because I think it's really relevant. How do you even then go about it if you have these different insights from different methodologies? I don't know who wants to go first. Bill unmuted first, so we'll take him.
And I'll try and be respectful of time. One of the interesting things about this is, why are you running this experiment, right? And we talk about experimentation, and we borrow a lot of language from the world of science, and we run tests. But really, you're looking to find out what model you can trust in the future, right? Is this model making predictions that I can then use to drive my car, to steer my business, right? And so one interesting question is the model falsifiable in and of itself, right? So if you're using an MMM, it's making a prediction, you're at a point on the saturation curve, it's making a prediction about the incremental value. You can vary that. You don't need to run a global on-off test. You don't need to turn off all spend. You can actually ask, you can vary the spend a little bit and see whether the model is accurate at predicting. Not whether, is it a thing that will let you pull a lever and see a result? And that's a really interesting thing to be able to do. And so one of the things we actually advocate is that when people do spend plans, they don't say, okay, I'm going to run a budget optimizer. Here's my ideal spend. Let me go and do that. That instead they view it as a weekly or daily sequence of different spend plans where they systematically alter to gain confidence. Not a global on-off, but just a little, okay, what if I put 10% more in Snapchat? What happens, right? Mm-hmm. And that lets you, that has all sorts of really good data science properties, from breaking multicollinearity and so on. But it also lets you test the forecasting capabilities, because that's really what you want. Ultimately, if I have a measurement system and it tells me what happened in September, so what? I want it to tell me what to do in January. Mm-hmm. And so we have a very strong bias towards systems that forecast and then trying to falsify the forecasts. Mm-hmm. You still run into, there's just really interesting things that happen. And you can do this, for example, in mobile marketing in games, right? So if you're on iOS, you get 32 landing pages inside the Apple Store, custom product pages. That's really interesting. They're normally used for SEO, for fine-tuning your marketing messages, but you can also assign them to specific marketing channels and then use that to verify your MMP. Yep. And so you can, and that's not an A/B test where you turn off advertising. That's simply saying, I'm going to add in another measurement stream in order to validate a specific measurement methodology. And so you do that. And you do these things, and you still wind up with things that disagree, right? And you still wind up, if you're using a multi-touch system and then, your MMP is last touch, they will disagree dramatically. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No one really has a good way of resolving that issue, as far as I know. No.
Yeah, I agree with everything Bill said. Not much to add, right? Also from forecasting, this idea of triangulation. If two things disagree, you get a third opinion. And if you always try to get three sources of evidence, and if they all three roughly agree, great. If two disagree, you should understand why. If all three disagree, you have a real problem. And maybe because I'm an academic also, but I always would ultimately trust a well set up and proven and established MMM most of all sources. Of course, that requires a certain level of scale across a number of channels. You can't do that if you're just servicing one or two channels and you don't have historic data. But ultimately, I think this is the strategic backbone of the operation in my mind.
Interesting. Just going back to what we said about game companies and maturity, the words "well set up" are carrying a hell of a lot of weight there.
Yeah, that's a tiny little detail, right?
Any kind of business.
Great. Yes, we are at the end of the show. It was so great to have you. Learned a lot about gaming. I was the one with the least amount of gaming experience, so most amount of learning here to be done. So thanks so much. Would really appreciate a chance to have you on the show. Maybe, I don't know, in the new year, around April, we can set something up. Always good to talk to you. Thanks so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and also thanks to our two Tims here on the side. And of course, also to the audience for tuning in. Again, we also now available on Apple Podcasts, so make sure to subscribe there. As always, also on Spotify, YouTube, TikTok and Instagram as well. We learned. So yeah, good. Thanks again for being here, and talk to you all later. Bye bye.
Thank you. Fun
Pleasure.
conversation.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.